I've got issues here. Okay.
You're right.
Oh, yeah, I'm ready to go. This is by far the most important action I've taken as a councillor. Our community's #1 crisis across the peninsula is housing. From Balnarring to Portsea, Hastings to Mornington, we have a multifaceted crisis that has only been exacerbated by COVID. When I ran for council, I understood that homelessness was an issue due to the advocacy of former Mayor Sam Hearn. I also knew house prices were rising steeply. However, it wasn't until I became a councillor and had the opportunity to meet so many people in our community that I began to see the housing crisis unfold. The first problem I encountered was the lack of affordable accommodation for workers over summer. This meant that many of our hospitality and tourism businesses ran fewer shifts or had completely overworked staff. This issue has been compounded with the lack of long-term affordable rental accommodation, which means other businesses cannot get enough staff. This in turn impacts our economic development potential. Many long-term residents must leave the peninsula, even pulling their kids out of school communities at a time when they crave stability. Our information and community support centres are reporting multiple cases of pensioner widows facing life living in their cars, as well as an increase in numbers with their homeless outreach programs. The peninsula has no crisis accommodation for women and children fleeing domestic violence, so they face a heartbreaking dilemma of staying with their abusive partner, trying to find a place to crash or living in their car, and most vulnerable are left behind and in a perilous state of existence. As a tourist destination with few formal accommodation options, Airbnbs and other short stay rentals have proliferated. This has created extra pressure on our available housing stock for long-term accommodation, either for people to buy or rent. House prices on the peninsula in many areas have risen over 30% in the past year. We are not unique in this respect. Many LGAs across Australia and globally are grappling with how to deal with this phenomenon. Therefore, I'm calling on the federal government to assist with this matter rather than the state, because it is an Australia-wide issue. In Byron Shire, 20% of the housing stock is now Airbnbs, with terrible ramifications for that region. Colac, Otway and Surf Coast Shires have already declared a housing crisis, particularly in relation to key and essential worker accommodation. As councillors, we often lamented our lack of advocacy impact. By working with our fellow coastal councils, we can create collective impact at the negotiating table. One of my bugbears as a councillor has been inheriting legacy issues. To brush this under the carpet because it's too difficult and too big will just kick the can down the road, and the problem will increase. This declaration amplifies the significant amount of work already undertaken by our officers and shows our community that we do see them, even the ones without agency to email, call or mount their own community campaign. This is a call to arms for our Shire. A multidisciplinary approach is required. We need to think imaginatively, compassionately and harness the goodwill in our community to create a vibrant peninsula where we value all our residents. To my fellow councillors, I'm asking for your support in declaring a housing crisis, so our people know we've seen and heard them. We focus our Shire on creating a vibrant and inclusive community, and we have a bold and collaborative position to advocate from. I'm asking you, will you stand by or stand up?
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillor McCafferty.
May I reserve my right, Mayor O'Connor, please?
Yeah. Is anyone else wanting to speak? Councillor Gill.
Sorry, it wouldn't work again. Thank you. I'm foreshadowing during this for an amendment. An amendment will be in number 2, calls on the federal government and the state government. And then in part 6, requests that a report be presented to council, the federal government and the state government with the required actions necessary, so on. In moving the amendment, and I'll wait for a seconder, we need to spell out that it's not the council's responsibility, it's council trying to do the best we can, and I want to discuss that.
I'm on mute now. Is there a seconder, councillors, to this amendment? Councillor Marr.
Thank you. And it's good to have a seconder so that there is debate. We could be accused of bias if we don't do this. it becomes a political matter. I moved the foreshadowed earlier, and I note that that wasn't taken up, it wasn't mentioned in the debate so far, and I don't know why not. Why are we aiming at the federal government when most, I believe, a large proportion of the responsibility is state government? Is there some sort of bias involved? Why aren't we? Why are we mentioning one level of government and not the main one? So it's clear that we wouldn't be taken seriously if we pursue it in that manner. So it's fairly clear we need to change that. We need to be have the ability, no matter what our political leanings might be, to address this properly. We've been told that it's the #1 issue, and yet we're not going about it properly. We have to include the state government and equally the federal government for not bearing the full responsibility that they have. I agree with all of the points made, and I agree with the motion, apart from that part, because it is a crisis. It's one that we all recognise and we all want to do something about. We can only do a small part of what's really necessary. It's not up to ratepayers to find the real changes that can be made. It's up to us to report it. It's up to us to call for the report. It's up to us to do what we can do, and we have made steps in that direction, considerable steps, costing many millions of dollars. But we don't have crisis housing on the Mornington Peninsula because of the state government. They refuse, and yet we're not mentioning them. So let's be fair and equal-handed in this. Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Ma, did you wish to speak?
Yes, through the chair, I do. I just want to bring to the attention too that I have thought about what's before us today, Councillor Race's notice of motion. One of the reasons why I actually wanted to be part of the AAA Housing Committee was to look at what we can do for our communities in crisis. So I agree with all that's been said. I do want to, though, bring to the attention that it is mainly state. Then we can look at federal rather than federal and state. So having said that, if we can just, if it's possible at this point to put in Councillor Gill's amendment to put state then federal. I know it's only semantics, but if we can just put state and then
We can't do
federal.
it.
Thank you.
I don't think that can be changed right now without another amendment.
Right now. Okay, I'm just following through the continuity of what is on the officers' comment too, because they've put in that order of state and federal, but we can look at that a little later. The other thing that I just want to bring to the attention to is that we need to spend time in our own backyard rather than looking at what Australia is doing. I know that is a crisis all around. It's a crisis in the world, but just let's look at our own backyard first and look at the Mornington Peninsula and draw on all the municipalities that are close to us rather than looking afar. I think that that's more time better spent and energy spent looking at what we've got right here. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ma. Anyone else wishing to speak to the amendment?
Mayor O'Connor, I think that you've frozen.
It's frozen.
Yeah. There is a thunderstorm here and there's lightning, so
Yeah, I blacked it. I went completely offline.
yeah.
Miss Sapaloo, at this point, what do we do? Do we call a recess? No, we can't even call a recess.
I'd suggest at this point that if Councillor Race is comfortable in stepping in as deputy,
Yep.
She's definitely.
otherwise we can convene, take a break for a couple of minutes and hope that Mayor O'Connor gets back on.
Should we take
Can
5
I,
and come?
can I suggest that we elect somebody as chair, because Councillor Race has moved the motion, and we can do that, and we're almost completed, that we could move on.
Oh, Despys looks like she's back, I think.
Oh, there she is.
Sorry, councillors, big bit of thunder and lightning right here. I think it just zapped my internet. Okay, Councillor Bisson, did you want to speak to the amendment, or are you?
I'll save it for debate. Thanks.
Yeah, councillors, I'm putting the amendment that Councillor Gill has moved to the vote. All those in favour of the amendment? And against? Carried. Okay, we're going back to the substantive. And Councillor Race has spoken to the substantive, and Councillor McCafferty reserved her right. Is there anyone wanting to speak? Councillor Bissinger.
Yes, I'd like to speak to anything that's going to threaten our livelihoods down here. We have two main industries down here, if you like, agriculture and tourism. And also, so we definitely can't sort of start dictating about housing affordability and all that kind of stuff if it affects anything that has to do with our tourism. There's also one thing that hasn't been addressed at all. We're not like any of the other areas. We're completely aware, as Councillor Marr mentioned the other day, we're girt by sea. We've got nowhere to go. We've got nowhere to expand to. We've got a fixed green wedge. We've got very fixed urban growth boundaries. We've got a strong border at the top when you hit Frankston. We've got nowhere to go. It's the same as people, and I can't help but liken it to the same as people wanting to live in Albert Park and have to settle somewhere else. It's just a natural fact of life, and to expect a council to manipulate or even a government to manipulate house pricing is not realistic. I've put proposals forward to the councillors before about the council owning and renting out properties, developing and renting out properties. That's the only way that I can see that we can ever have an affordable housing on the peninsula, because that's the only thing that we can control. Everything else is very much up in the air. The state government has, regardless of which state government, the state government has let us down over the years. Every other state in Australia is sitting at their social housing at 4.5% of their total housing stock. We're sitting at 3.2. It was put to us that 1,200 houses would have to be built by the state government every year for a decade to catch up with the other states. And as we know, the other states are already having a major issue with their housing affordability and their social housing as well. So we are way on the back foot with this. And then the recent, I can't remember the figures, someone else may, the recent position put forward by the state government suggested they were going to do so many, I think it was 800 houses a year or something, which when you think about it, it sounds like 800 houses sounds a lot. But then if you're already 1,200 houses behind, it just doesn't make sense. So at the end of the period of time, at the end of another 10 years, we're going to be so much worse off than even the other states. Now, there's no doubt that we have to advocate for housing from the state government, but declaring a crisis does two things. First of all, it gives people a platform to bounce all kinds of weird things off. Look what's happened to our climate emergency. And then you've got also the issue of people just becoming totally desensitized to the word crisis.
Councillor Bissinger, your time is up.
Done.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak? Councillor Marsh.
Thanks, and through the Mayor. I just want to be clear again, I'm not going to debate the merit of this item, but as councillors, we have to consider two things at least when we make decisions, and one is merit and the other is process. On merit, I find it pretty hard to make an informed decision when I've seen no report come from council on this issue. I know there's anecdotal evidence, I'm not debating anything that was said before me, but we have a AAA housing committee, we have a housing council consultative group. These groups have been operating, doing a lot of work, it seems, over the last 12 months. But I, as a councillor, being asked to make a declaration of a crisis, again, ignore the issue, but a declaration of a crisis, which is absolutely significant policy based on the things that we said it will help us attain. I'm being asked to make a decision that contradicts the governance rules that we just adopted without any data in front of me, apart from a one-page nom. I find that problematic. And again, I think if you take the issue or the merit of the issue away, I'm not sure people would be supporting this from a process point of view. And it does sort of seem to me that despite just adopting rules to prevent this type of thing happening, because the majority of councillors agree with the merit, we're just going to ignore the process. And I'm yet to hear a single person give me a good answer as to how this is not a process issue. I'm not debating the declaration of a crisis. I'm debating the process that was just adopted by numerous people sitting around this virtual table today. So again, I absolutely understand the desire to jump on this, but Councillor Gill flagged a potential amendment, which was just a call for a report, which could have been in 2 weeks' time to justify this decision so that we comply with the process. Everyone's got the same information and I would have had no issue with it, but that hasn't occurred. So unfortunately, purely from process, I can't support this decision. And I think it sets up a precedent where we might as well just put a strike through in that rule because it is useless. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Marsh. Anyone else wishing to speak? Councillor Challey.
Thank you, through the Mayor, and I commend this motion that is before the Council and I support its intention. I also support its legitimate process through the governance rules. And this motion raises awareness of the housing crisis and the house availability and affordability that we have here on the peninsula. There are many actions that this council can take to address the past, current and emerging issue, which has been further exacerbated by the COVID pandemic impact on livelihoods, work and income. We're seeing an increase in people experiencing homelessness for the very first time in their life on the peninsula. No one would ever believe that the Mornington Peninsula would be facing a housing crisis that impacts on housing availability and affordability. I'm not talking about affordability for those who can afford to buy or build. That is not what this debate is about. It's about those who are in poverty, homeless, and who can't afford to rent, let alone buy. But the news is we have been identified as the highest LGA in Victoria for housing shortage and have a high demand seeking support for housing and rental stress, with an increase in the prevalence of people sleeping in their cars on the foreshore, couch surfing, families that have to leave their communities because of a lack of crisis housing and low availability of rentals, as well as those at risk having to flee because of domestic violence in our community. The risk factors associated with the risk of homelessness are many, but what is alarming is the decrease in affordable housing on the peninsula from 72.5% availability in 2001 to a shocking 6% availability in 2019, with the wait list for public housing increasing to 1,818 applications. The stark reality of the housing availability issue on the peninsula reveals that a significant proportion of our residents are experiencing housing stress and affordability issues. That is not okay. By reaffirming the Everybody's Home campaign, the Regional Local Government Homelessness Charter and Council's policy position through the AAA Housing Plan 2020 to 2030, there is a lot that this council can do, as officers have explained in their comments to this notice of motion. We need to get to work to help raise awareness, advocate to state and federal government for policy positions that will help mitigate the negative impacts of housing affordability on the peninsula and help those at risk in a more meaningful and result-driven way to achieve safe, available and affordable housing on our beautiful Mornington Peninsula. So I commend this motion and support Councillor Race and Councillor McCafferty. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Challey. Anyone else wishing to speak to this motion? Councillor McCafferty, did you want to speak again? Oh, sorry, not again. Did you want to use your right?
Yes, thank you, Mayor O'Connor, and through you. Big topic. There's long-standing social inequities on the Mornington Peninsula that are significantly exacerbated. As we all know, there were people living below the poverty line in my ward and elsewhere across the municipality well before this pandemic hit. With regards to homelessness on the peninsula, I think historically the problem has been that it's largely invisible. From a practical perspective, people who are currently homeless and sleeping rough on the foreshore are not overtly obvious. They typically keep to themselves out of sight, and I can attest to this from my time practicing as a mental health nurse in the community, because heartbreakingly, it was not unusual for us to go looking for clients who had sought refuge in the vegetation and scrub along the foreshore. From a data collection perspective, in order to generate these reports, census data collection has been ineffective at capturing people with no fixed address, including couch surfing and rough sleepers. And despite enormous effort this year to rectify it, COVID once again got in the way. We cannot rely on this exclusively. This problem requires us to get out and talk to our people in our communities. We need to talk to the abundance of people facing mortgage stress, the families who cannot find a single rental that they can afford, the online community notice boards where I see people reaching out and desperately searching for somewhere to live. We need to talk to the schools and hear the stories of families moving miles away from their support networks and the people that they rely on in order to keep a roof over their head. There were 2,283 family violence incidents in 2019-20, and between March and December last year, there was a 23% spike in increased family violence reports. We need to talk to the service providers in our communities. Where are these people going who are experiencing violence? Do we have adequate provisions of crisis accommodation and social housing and affordable rentals? I think we all know the answer to that. And are we okay with this situation? Are we willing to accept it? I'm certainly not. We can recognise that this significant problem exists without another report. I'm sorry, but we just need to get on with fixing it. We've already had the debate back and forth about the need for the report, and I don't think it's as clear cut and objective. I do think there's some grey areas there, but this calls for a report that presents us with the required actions necessary to mitigate the worst impacts. And that's what we need right now. We need solutions. We need to be using council officer time to bring us tangible options, not confirmation of what we already know. And we do know it. Other levels of government recognise that it's a complex issue. We've got research papers from the Victorian government that tell us the housing is becoming more unaffordable and more people are experiencing housing stress. We have annual reports from our community support services telling us that they're experiencing the highest attendance rates on record for their programs that support people sleeping rough or experiencing other forms of homelessness. And the report that from March, they said when the moratoriums ended and the supplementary payments dried up, was when they began to see the worst ripple effects of this. The beginnings of a housing crisis quickly became apparent. And
Councillor
may I ask for an extension, please?
I will give you a 1 minute extension.
Thank you. The beginnings of a housing crisis quickly became apparent and have grown into a flood of people behind on rent, facing eviction and becoming homeless. Businesses are reporting workforce shortages, and the Australian Financial Review in April reported that from the cheapest to most expensive, Mornington Peninsula suburbs dominate rankings for the steepest price rises, and that we occupied all top 5 price positions across the market. The notice of motion calls for support from the federal government as well as the state now that the amendment's been accepted. And simply building more houses does not address the inequality we are seeing. We need to find a way to retain existing housing stock rather than much of it being held as vacant investment or being used as tourism investments, because urgent action is required from these governments to establish some parameters to reduce the spiralling inequity that we're seeing in our communities. This continual uptrend in house prices that outstrips wage growth is a huge concern. It should not be left to local governments or even state governments alone. All need to be on par with us. We must advocate to both of them also. The reality is that an unequal society with a high degree of economic polarisation is going to undermine our economy in the longest term. It's a serious problem. We're not meeting the basic needs of the people in our community. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs describes the need for shelter, food, water and clothing as being the biological component for human survival. We're not meeting them.
Thank you, Councillor.
I commend my fellow councillors to support this motion. We need to do something.
Thank you,
please.
Thank you, Councillor McCafferty.
Thank you.
Councillor Race, would you like to close debate?
So, and thank you everybody for contributing to this afternoon's debate. It's a really important issue. As I said, it's the #1 issue on the peninsula. We currently have abject market failure, and so we need to think imaginatively about how we address this issue. And I do thank Councillor Gill for his amendment. I do think this is it's everyone to the pump. It does need to be federal and state government. We definitely can't do this on our own. But these are our people. We've got 168,000 of them here on the peninsula, and not all of them are doing really well. And we need to make sure that we look after the people on our peninsula. As to the terms of governance, if this NOM didn't meet the governance rules, I would have expected it to be rejected before it even got up and to ask me to revisit it. But I revisited this NOM about 3 or 4 times. I worked with council officers, I worked with governance to get it to where it is. So it's not a massive policy position. Where we might take massive policy positions is in the report. For example, Cornwall has declared that by 2050, they will have no homeless people and all children will be living in secured accommodation. That is a massive different policy position, but that's one we could take. I understand people aren't necessarily keen to look overseas or either further into Australia, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's amazing things happening all over the place, and we can use our council officers, we can use our great army of people to go and investigate those and see what would apply to the Mornington Peninsula. There's some really exciting stuff, and I think some of Councillor Bissinger's ideas would be great to add into the mix over here. So I do ask my fellow council officers today to declare a housing crisis so we can get on and start looking after our people of the peninsula and do some really exciting and innovative things to address this issue. It is really important, and we can't leave our people behind anymore. So I commend this motion to the vote, and I hope you all support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillors, we have a motion before us, and I'm going to put it to the vote. All those in favour?
By division.
By division.
By division. All those in favour? Councillor O'Connor, Councillor Gill, Councillor Challey, Councillor Race, Councillor Mercurio, Councillor Marr, Councillor McCafferty. And all those against? Councillor Bissinger, Councillor Marsh. The motion is carried.